Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, December 8th, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. So we've got a great one for you this week. We've only got one more after this week, and then we take 2 weeks off for the holiday break, and we will see you in the new year. Another really complex conversation, a super important conversation. This week, it's with Dr. Thea Riofrancos. She's an associate professor of political science at Providence College, a strategic co-director of the Climate and Community Institute, and also a fellow at the Transnational Institute. And she wrote a new book that grapples with some really important topics. It's called Extraction: The Frontiers of Green Capitalism. You're not going to want to miss this. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Thea Riofrancos. Well, Thea, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm thrilled to be here.
So I'm glad that we got in. Your book has been out by the time this airs for about 2 months, but I'm glad that we were able to kind of snag you. I don't know if you're still doing book tour stuff or if I'm sort of at the tail end of it.
I'm still in the thick of it. I'm going to New York City tomorrow, actually, for a book event there.
Perfection. Okay, good to know. So I'm excited to talk to you not just about, the book, but also about your work in general, get to know you a little bit better first. I think before we get into Extraction, I'd love to hear sort of how you got into political science, if that's always been your academic focus or if your path has meandered a bit.
It has always been my academic focus since I was an undergrad. And actually, I decided to major in political science before I even arrived at college. I filled out some form, what do you want your major to be? And you could choose nothing. You could say undeclared. And I was like, no, I will do political science. And I actually didn't really like my first political science class. No shade on that professor, but it didn't really grab me. But I was stubborn and was I care so much about politics. I was already an activist and a left-wing progressive activist, at that young age. And so I just thought, I care about activism. I care about changing the world. Therefore, I need to learn the science of politics. And, despite not always agreeing with some of the mainstream approaches or theories, or sometimes not loving what I was reading, I just stuck with it through undergrad. I didn't plan to get a PhD initially, but I ended up, a couple of years after college graduation going for a PhD. And I've stuck with it the whole time, even though in some ways I'm a kind of unusual political scientist. But my love of politics and the study of politics has stayed with me.
Okay, so tell me, what is it that makes you an unusual political scientist?
A few things. So, and one is very germane to the show, which is that I've worked on mining and the politics of resource extraction for a very long time, since 2010, when I was first starting my dissertation. So a decade and a half. And when I first got interested in mining, I was kind of an odd person out. It was just not something that political scientists cared about. There weren't many political science books on it. The only resource that political science cared about was oil, which makes sense. Oil is super geopolitically relevant and, relevant in all sorts of ways. But every other resource didn't get a lot of attention in political science. But by that point, I had spent a lot of time in Latin America, and I knew that there was a ton of social conflict over mining, and it was escalating. And also the role of mining in the political economy of Latin America and the global South more broadly was growing. And I had a bit of a preview to that because I lived in Latin America and been on the ground, so to speak. So it took a little convincing to my committee, my advisors, and in my PhD to say, no, really trust me on this one. Mining it's not oil. But it is very important, and you can learn a lot about global history and state society dynamics and corporations by zooming in on this sector. And, I think that in the end, I was vindicated. I don't just mean with my book that we're talking about today, but that there over time became a lot more social science research on this topic. And I got to sort of see it from the ground floor in certain ways.
It's funny. I feel like in some ways you just answered the big question that was on my mind opening up here, which is, and I don't even know if I formulated exactly what the crux of the question is, but very often when we think of political science, we think of government, economics, we think of international relations. And we think about, at least those of us who are not in the field, governmental or economic sort of structures in a very, I don't know, like ineffable way, or like a
Mhm.
almost like a theoretical way. But how could you possibly be an expert in anything relating to geopolitics if you're not digging deep into capitalism, right? Like it's so fundamental to the way that our societies and therefore nations interact with one another.
Yeah, what's fascinating about mining is, and extractive sectors in general, so this also
Mhm.
includes oil for sure, is that it's a place where so much is condensed. You have
Mm.
obviously the physical resource and the landscape, and then the whole area of like, there are habitats here, there are communities here, there's a watershed, right? So you have the whole kind of natural and physical environment, let's say. Then you have corporations that are usually the ones like doing the extracting or surveying or exploring or whatever. So you have capitalism, as you just said, and the investors and finance behind all of that. And then you have the state as well, and they're really important in resource extraction. Government agencies are, and bureaucrats and politicians, in ways that is not always the case in every sector of the economy. But in resource extraction, because the resources are in the state's territory, they are in that physical place, right? And also because resource extraction often gets linked to like national security or strategic
Yeah.
interests of the state. And because, of course, it's quite environmentally impactful, it fundamentally changes the land use from whatever predated the mining project. A mining company has to kind of work through the state in order to get access to its asset. And
Mm.
that
Mhm.
does not mean that the mining company is like subservient to the state or the state is really in charge. There's all sorts of corruption, let's say, or regulatory capture that can really mean that the company is directing the process, but they still have to go through those state agencies to get access to the resource that they want to exploit. So it sort of condenses everything about politics, economics, but yet also the natural world and also kind of community organizing and community life.
Oh, it's such a fascinating concept, especially when we're talking about this, I guess, this global capitalistic bent that we see. Like, not all nations are capitalist, obviously, but there is a capitalistic pressure that we see across the
Mm.
globe where ultimately the bottom line is what informs decision making. And I think that we all, not we all, those of us who promote more of a balanced kind of socialist capitalist system, we understand the necessity of like regulation, and that,
Mhm.
things, the wheels can't just come off. But ultimately, a lot of decisions are made about the way we treat our planet and about the what we take from, the air, the ground, the water, because of the bottom line, right? I mean, is that the main driving force?
Yeah, it is absolutely going to be the case that no mining company is going to extract a resource if it's unprofitable. Or maybe I
Right.
should specify that a little bit. No shareholder-owned multinational mining company is going to do that. The reason I'm
Mhm.
already like complexifying what I'm saying is that you do have other types of resource firms in the world, state-owned companies. Sometimes, in China, you have conglomerates that mix like state ownership and private ownership kind of in the same, corporate conglomerate. So, and sometimes those companies act a little bit differently. It's not that they don't care about the economics of their operation, but they may not be trying to make like Wall Street happy or financiers happy because they may
Mhm.
be financed by the state in certain ways, right? Or by state loans. Whereas the kind of typical Western mining company, whether Canadian, American, Australian, European, British, etc., that's shareholder owned, they absolutely have to meet what's called their fiduciary obligation to shareholders, which is maximize the value of their shares. So they're not even only concerned about whether the mining project is profitable, but how that profit will influence the entire value of their company that shareholders own. So it's
Mhm.
highly mediated by different logics of profitability, of finance, of kind of what's the threshold at which something becomes economically interesting to a firm. And they have to calculate all that again in tandem with like trying to shape state officials and agencies to get them the access that they want to that resource.
And I mean, ultimately, and I mean, maybe this is a really cynical view, and I'm really interested in your feedback here because it's hard for me. I'm a psychologist, right? That's my background. I'm a psychologist and I'm a science communicator, and I am in no way involved in geopolitics, although it does really fascinate me. I can't help but feel like with this sort of amped up capitalistic mentality that we see where like greed is good and where like, oh, I'm just doing what the shareholders are pressuring me to do. What ends up happening is decisions are made at all costs, and those costs end up being costs to the environment, to the local habitat, to the workers, to the water that they drink, to, that people die, animals die, plants die, and it's sort of the cost of doing business.
Yeah, I mean, these are referred to in kind of standard mainstream economic theory as externalities. They
Hmm.
are effects of capitalist investment or production, but they're not, the costs of them are actually not borne by the company themselves, right? So pollution is a classic externality. But we
Yeah.
could even think of like social conflict as an externality, right? Insofar as environmental impacts often generate social conflict, whether that takes the form of protest or the kind of even maybe more tragic form of like divisions among community members for scarce resources. Like if water becomes scarce precisely because a mining company is using a lot of water, that can generate protests. It can also generate division and distrust within the community, tearing apart the social fabric. All of that is like an externality. It's kind of like, just a casualty or collateral damage, we might say, of
Yeah.
mining. And it's up to community organizers, but also like, I think, good faith public officials to ensure to the best of their ability that the company actually pays those costs in some way, or some of the cost is borne by the company, whether by sanctioning them or actually requiring them to like do remediation or cleanup or whatever it is.
But do you notice how that's always being it always comes at the back end through like lawsuits or through
Yes,
like state action. It's
absolutely.
never built in from the beginning.
This is very important, actually. It's a very astute point that you're making. A lot of regulation, unfortunately, of environmental harm is like ex post facto. And not only that, it has a forensic, like detective quality, because you have
Mm.
to, after the fact, figure out, okay, was this contamination linked to this mine site, or was it this like diesel generator that's powering this mining equipment that like spilled into this watershed? And you have to connect the dots, and it's like detective work, and the
Mhm.
companies and their lawyers and experts will make the threshold really high for their own accountability. But and the state has to like not only figure out who made the mess, but sometimes again, like the public sector is cleaning up the mess after
Mhm.
the fact. And so it really we really have to think proactively about harm prevention or like harm reduction. I actually borrow that term sometimes from the public health and public health world of
Yeah.
like harm reduction. It's like, how can we at the outset reduce the impact and also clarify responsibility in a legal sense so that it's not such a complicated legal morass or quagmire after the fact in terms of assigning responsibility.
Absolutely. And I mean, I guess the big question is how do we do that? I mean, it's a bit more rhetorical than anything. I want to make a quick left turn, or it's going to feel like a left turn, possibly. But to me, it's very connected in my brain. And I'm going to see if I can do a halfway decent job of communicating that. One of the other podcasts that I work on, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, it's myself and four gentlemen who are like my brothers. They're a little bit older than me, and they're all from Connecticut. So, three of them are brothers. One is a dear friend of theirs. They came up together. They have very similar worldviews. I'm younger, female, California, just like different, but not that different. One of the things that we constantly argue about, even though we agree about many, many things, one of the things we butt heads about a lot is uh, crewed space travel. And one of the places where I constantly dig my heels in when they become very techno optimist is
Mm.
the idea that a lot of what they say is the motivation for crewed space travel has to do with extractive practices. And I always compare it to a colonialist viewpoint, and they always tell me I'm making like a straw man. And so I'm really curious your take.
You're correct.
Okay. I mean, I can't.
I mean,
how can it not be the same thing?
Yeah,
just because there might not be people living on Mars.
Totally. But there are, there is non-human nature. I mean, in the sense of, if we want to use the term nature broadly, not only to apply to the planet Earth, but also to other natural phenomena in the universe.
Yeah, or life. Course, like maybe there's not life, but that doesn't matter.
And we're still, and we don't know. We don't know, right? I mean, not to be like, it's not about UFO conspiracies, but just like we are still investigating, I'm pretty sure, like the possibility of life on other planets. Yeah.
We're always finding proteins and traces of water and, and we're actively looking for it.
Right. And not only, I mean, I think there's there's so much in this that we probably, I won't go fully down the rabbit hole because I think there's, it's not for no reason that a lot of science fiction uses the kind of trope of we went to another planet to take these resources, but then it turns out we need workers to get the resources. So then we actually created a colony. Even if there weren't people already there, we put people there. Maybe those people are considered a different class or race from the ruling elite people, right? I'm thinking of The Expanse. I'm thinking of lots of sci-fi shows that this has been the central conceit, right? So, minerals don't mine themselves. Even if there are robots or things are automated, someone needs to make the robots, someone might need to maintain the facilities. And so even if we're not colonizing an indigenous people, let's say, if we were going to outer space or mining asteroids, we are in effect thinking about how to create extraterrestrial resource frontiers that would perhaps be very similar in their dynamics of devastation of the environment and also conflict among people as the ones that we have on Earth.
And conflict among nations, right? Because if there's one asteroid that's got a lot of water on it or a lot of, gold or some sort of, cobalt or something we really need, then who says which nation gets to drill it?
And this is happening right now with deep sea mining, which I don't work on myself. I haven't done research on it, but I read about it a lot because it's fascinating and quite disturbing. But there currently is a race to control the deep seas of international waters. And there's a UN body that's supposed to regulate all of that in an equitable multilateral way. And then we have a combination of Trump and also some mining companies that have done a lot to really lobby this UN, under their former leadership, which wasn't that great. They have a better leader now, but there's been regulatory capture, in other words. And Trump is just basically saying, you know what, we're not even party to this agreement because the US never signed this agreement on international waters. So companies can just get a license for us and mine anywhere. That literally something the Trump government did in an executive action. Ugh. So, and now all these states that are wait a second, we thought we were doing this long-term negotiation to figure out who has the right to do this and under what governance and multilateral schemes. So we have people just kind of treating it as the Wild West instead. But it's exactly like you're saying.
And that's a recapitulation of I'm guessing, and this is what I want to get into, a lot of the mining issues that you do study, right, is when you have you've got the individual issues. Gosh, we could probably break this down a million different ways, but you've got, let's say, a city-state, a state, a nation, however, they identify their borders, that is self-contained and governed, and we're talking about extraction on their own land. And then you have areas that are sort of up for debate or up for grabs, as some might see them. And what do you do when there's a global kind of consortium and then there are superpowers like the United States, Russia, China, and others who are we don't care what they say. We're just going to do what we want.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's really fascinating when we think about the kind of role of geopolitics and national security interests and the way that those intermingle with corporate interests. Now, it's not always an easy story because sometimes those can be distinct. Sometimes what a state official considers in its national interest is not exactly the bottom line of a company, but oftentimes they have worked together in resource extraction. I mean, the classical case is early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century imperialism, where powerful states, European, American, British, et cetera, were scouring the world for resources. And they were really working quite closely with corporations headquartered in their states, right? To sort of
Mm-hmm.
the state military maybe did the colonizing, but then the company got like a charter or a concession or a lease to do the extracting or the plantation harvesting or whatever it was. And so these can be very aligned forces that create really deep extractive frontiers over time. Or what I mean by deep is that they're very durable. Like the same places that were extracted from then, like continue to be treated this way by companies, even though now they're governed ostensibly by like independent sovereign states. They're no longer colonies. But the relationship remains what many people call like neo-colonial. It's like
Yeah.
colonialism, but like in an era of technical or formal independence.
Yeah, I can't help but think about like I don't know, like Me Too and like consent and a lot of the
Oh,
issues
yeah.
that it's not that different. Like, okay, two consenting adults make a decision, but when one has a lot of power over another one because it's,
Hmm.
your boss or because it's somebody who can control the outcome of your career and like yeah, just because a country is independent, but they really rely on another country for like some form of financing
Exactly. Exactly.
yeah,
And
I
they
mean,
rely on that resource in a sense for their tax revenue and their like the economic
mhm.
basis of their state, of their economy. And so it's this dual dependency, like on the foreign investor, on the corporation to do the investment, and also on the resource itself, because that's what might generate revenues. This is especially the case in like so-called petrostates, but also in states with large mining sectors as well.
So I want to get into that. So I mean, first and foremost, I think we dove in because I was like, I have questions, I kind of made the assumption for the listener that when we say extraction, that we know what that actually means. But it is what it sounds like, right? Like literally extracting things out of the ground, out of the water, out of the air, whatever, resources that are needed for a country, a business, a people to continue to live their lives the way they want to live them.
Absolutely. And, we use extraction sometimes as like a metaphor,
Mm.
when we think about like relationships between workers and bosses, our relationship with like big tech or big finance, like it constantly feels like stuff is being extracted from us, like our personal
Hmm.
information. There's a lot of metaphorical uses of the term that are fine and are instructive. But I think, what we're talking about here is maybe more literal use of the term of
Yeah.
extraction. And we're talking about the removal of resource deposits from where they sit in the Earth's crust, right? So it could be the extraction of oil, a hydrocarbon or, fossil fuel deposit, coal, fossil gas. Those are all extracted, but so are minerals. And what
Hmm.
they have in common, because we'll be talking more about mining of minerals today than about like oil extraction, though I'm happy to chat about that too if you want. But what all of those have in common is the resources are like specific deposits in specific places that you need to get access to. That's what we talked about, with the role of the state, but
Hmm.
also that they are non-renewable resources, at
Right.
least on human timescales. Of course, like in theory, since all of these were the result of, on the one hand, geological processes and climatic processes over millennia that formed the mineral deposits, or in the case of hydrocarbon, of course, the decomposition of organic life that happened similarly over millennia. Like
Hmm.
in theory, that could repeat, but like it's not going to repeat while we're on this planet. And it's not clear that it would repeat at all because a lot of it resulted, as you know, on a science podcast from like majorly contingent events, even at the origins of our planet. And
Yeah, like
so,
it might happen when we all
right.
go
Right,
extinct,
right, right.
but
Yeah, I
that's not
mean,
very
yeah,
helpful.
not very
Yeah.
helpful right now. So
Yeah.
the non-renewability is important. It's not to necessarily say we're about to run out or it's scarce. I don't know how old you are, but I am old enough to have lived through at least one moment where there was a major concern over like peak oil. Like, are we about to run
Mm.
out of oil? It turns out, oops, we could frack lots of stuff that we didn't know we could frack. And so actually the oil supply and the gas supply are way bigger in volume than we should ever tap into due to climate change, right? And so
Yeah.
oftentimes it's not that the non-renewability doesn't mean it's scarce, though there's some exceptions to that. There's some minerals that are getting towards being a little concerning in their underlying supply, but it's more that like we can't replenish them. And
Hmm.
also that like we're kind of doing resource drain. Like we're taking resources often from one place, we're transporting them to another place, usually to enter into like industrial supply chains. And so there's just a movement of stuff around the world, and the original source of it can't be replenished, which also can set up some of the feelings of injustice that people have in places where a lot of extraction takes place, which is like you're literally taking stuff, we can't put it back, and you're the ones benefiting from it, not us.
Yeah, and I think the sort of the other side of that, I'm thinking almost like a chemistry, like the equation, right? Like on one side, you have the actual resource itself, the extractive practices, all of the geopolitics that go along with that. On the other side of that, I think about why do we need this resource? What is it for? Why is there some sort of market pressure? And so much of it, and this is where sort of the idea of the frontiers of green capitalism come
Mm.
in. I think so much of it is surprising to people who haven't taken the time to think a little deeper, who have this binary way of thinking that like fossil fuels, and maybe they'll include in that like natural gas, and so gas and oil is like dirty and bad, and big oil is corrupt and this bad over here. But green energy, wind, water, electric over here, ooh, so good. Not realizing that there's so
Mm.
many like rare earth minerals and so many things that we have to physically extract to make the batteries for your electric car to go.
Yeah, I mean, this is the central thing that I'm grappling with in the book. I mean, both the question of what are the environmental costs of the energy transition, but
Hmm.
also this other question that you're bringing up, which is how to like compare and think through the huge amounts of volume of extraction that we are currently doing for the fossil fuel economy that still prevails,
Hmm.
compared to like an economy that would be run on zero emissions or hopefully a lot of specifically renewable energy, and what the mining would look like for that.
Right.
And, I've had a lot of debates, and they've been interesting with all sorts of like climate advocates, climate scientists, people in our shared world that like work on climate and energy. And, sometimes they will say very validly that why are you emphasizing all the mining of lithium and rare earths and cobalt when like we already live in an economy that is super extractive, and in fact more extractive than like a renewable economy would be, even if we
Mm.
take into account all the mining for renewable energy technologies. We don't have to mine for the fuel, because the fuel, so to speak, is the sun, the wind, the geothermal, etc. We're mining to create physical infrastructures to harness that, versus a fossil fuel economy where for everything to run, we need constant extraction and combustion of fuels.
And also
So
the downstream pollutants that come from
100,
all of
all
that.
of that,
Yeah.
all of that.
Yeah.
And so it is a fair point. My concern is when that is used as a way to like say we don't need to care about this whole mining for green
Hmm.
technologies thing. It's not important because it's smaller scale than like the mining that goes on every day for fossil capitalism. I don't like it as a means of like, let's not care, let's invisibilize this other set of harms. But also, I think it's missing something about the way the energy transition is happening. In
Hmm.
fact, we're not quite, at least not in the US for sure, in a moment that I would call a real energy transition, because that would mean we are keeping more and more fossil fuels underground, keep it in the ground, the
Hmm.
famous rallying cry of the climate movement, and instead transitioning more holistically towards renewable energy or other zero emissions sources. And instead, what we have is like all of the above, or like energy addition. We have more solar, we have more wind, but we also have more gas, we have more oil. And thanks to Trump, we're going to still like be eking out more coal because he's really incentivizing that
Ugh.
too. So it's
Yeah.
all of the above, it's all the
So we're
energy.
just
And they want
we're
more
just taking
nuclear, it's
more.
everything. It's
Yeah.
everything.
There's
And
just
that
more of
means
us that are more hungry for this stuff.
yeah. And there's like, that means that we have multiplying extractive frontiers simultaneously. Like we are
Mm.
still, the investigative reporters at like The Guardian and other outlets have done amazing work on like identifying what they call carbon bombs, which are like the most carbon intensive oil project, like the oil projects that are still in their early stages that haven't even gone through their whole life cycle yet, but that are going to emit like enormous amounts of carbon in the process of extracting, and of course in the process of combusting it even more. And so
Mhm.
we're still like, I mean, it's not we, right? We could be specific about who's doing the extraction and who's doing the investing, but I'm being vague just for a moment, just to say like we writ large humanity are
Mhm.
still extracting all of the fossil fuel stuff, and we're also extracting critical minerals for green technologies. And so there's just like an increase in the total planetary volume of extraction. I would love to see a situation, which I firmly advocate for, of like a full transition to zero emissions energy. And I know that that would involve some mining, and we can get into why in a moment, why we're even talking about mining so much right now, but it would involve some mining. We could do amazing stuff like recycle all the batteries and then not have to mine much anymore because we recover all the minerals from the batteries. Like there are
Hmm.
really cool things we could do if we lived in a cooler society. Like if we were actually concertedly planning this and making it happen with, as you said, regulation, with like the role of the public sector, with the role of community organizations and local governments. Like if we were really saying we're leaving the age of oil behind and we're fully going to renewables, and yes, some mining will be necessary. How much is always a social question. We can come back to that. But also these technologies are more durable. We don't like throw out a solar panel in a day the same way that a gasoline tank gets used up. So like there
Yeah.
is a real promise to lower how much extraction we have. But unfortunately, right now we're still extracting more of everything, and we're not planning this in the way to like reduce how much resources are ultimately needed.
I'm curious, and I mean, speaking in generalities here, right? Not like very specific numbers, but pre-Trump, were we more? I mean, obviously, we're probably more on track to have that future
Yeah.
that you mentioned, but we probably weren't actually on track,
Not
were we?
fully. We were
Yeah.
not even on track with Biden's own. So, prior to Trump, we had
Hmm.
Biden.
Hmm.
And sorry, I just laugh because I'm like, wow, just like almost sounds like
I
ancient
know.
history to even talk about these moments.
I
And then the
know.
figures themselves are so ancient. It's like, oh my gosh, what is our political system? But that's for another day. Anyways, we had, Biden in power, and, we had like a slim majority of Democrats. And so we got the Inflation Reduction Act passed, excuse me, which is a whole other thing we can talk about. Some environmental groups didn't like the IRA. Some climate groups did like it. There were even divisions, in our communities over like
Hmm.
this piece of legislation. But ultimately, I think we can all agree, just to not be too controversial, that it did help jumpstart much more renewable energy use, and also, as importantly, the sort of like manufacturing of the renewable energy technologies and the electric vehicles and all that stuff in the US, right? And that's
Yeah.
what its goals were. But even the like government's own, like the White House's own office of like calculating emissions reductions, said that like the IRA was like not actually gonna like go the full way. More
Right.
would be necessary, which is why the EPA was also doing things. There were some regulatory interventions to really like using maybe kind of harder tools to like get companies, and especially electricity utilities, to switch towards more zero emission sources. So there was a panoply of tools being used, but none of them were getting us exactly as far as we needed to go, but further than we had ever contemplated going before, because it was our first real piece of climate and energy legislation. And then, unceremoniously, a couple years later, Trump is like already dismantling all of that. So the
It hasn't even
US,
been a year.
I know, I can't
I
even, you're
can't
so
believe
right.
it.
I'm like,
It's
it,
it's so
it's
painful.
so
It
crazy.
feels like it has.
But you know what, the this is not to put a silver lining on anything, but it's more to say that like the US is increasingly like out of off trend with the global economy. That's not to say that the global economy is like decarbonizing rapidly. It's not at all. But it is to say that other countries are like making progress in ways that the US is now like in its own world. Like the US is like, nope, we're doubling down on fossil capitalism. We're also doubling down on fascism. Like we are like doubling down on these very reactionary, conservative ways of thinking about energy, the economy, politics, everything. And, the only hope right now, not the only hope, I don't want to exaggerate too much, but something that keeps me grounded as someone that works on climate, which is just a recipe for feeling depressed and angry all the time, is the fact that in other countries, not everyone, in fact, most countries are not following the US's lead. That doesn't mean they're doing perfectly or good enough. In fact, we're in the middle of COP30. A lot of reports are coming out showing that countries are failing to meet their own stated goals. That's all true. But like they're not failing as much as the US is, and they are making more incremental progress because these energy technologies have gotten so much more affordable, which all links back to China, which we don't have to go there right now. But just to lay it out that like the US is like decoupling in a way from the rest of the world.
I on the other show that I mentioned on SGU, we do like more timely news items, and I think it was just last week, as of this recording, the story that I covered was the UN like gap report where they showed sort of the
Exactly.
difference. Yeah. And basically in no kind of like their own people in the editorial were like, the planet is making progress and the US is undoing it.
Exactly. Exactly. And not only that, and you can fact check me and of course delete this if it's totally off base, but we just got this new report out from the International Energy Agency that
Mhm.
has this like new line on the curve. Like they have this whole they famously have this like peak oil chart where they try to
Mhm.
figure out when is not peak supply. That's nowhere near coming. I mean, we have plenty of oil, unfortunately, but peak
Yeah.
demand. Like, when is
Yeah.
demand going to peak and plateau and then go down such that we're really transitioning to new energy sources? And I'm pretty sure this is the reporting, like in major newspapers, that the Trump government lobbied the IEA to include a new figure on that same infographic to actually like slow down how quickly we get to peak oil demand, because like the US doesn't like the idea that the world might otherwise, if not for its like the US's insistence that we like really stay on oil, it might otherwise like reach peak oil demand more quickly. And now there's all this controversy around the IEA and like climate scientists being like, what are you doing? You actually just kind of cook the books here to like appease Trump. But in reality, the world is not fast enough, not fast enough. I don't want to sound optimistic or Pollyannish, but is
Right.
slowly but surely, like especially in the electricity sector, moving towards like peak oil demand and moving towards like a more renewable matrix of energy supply.
Well, and I see, and I'm curious, your take from this like international relations, this like political science perspective, because again, I'm always approaching these things through the lens of a psychologist. But
Mm-hmm.
when there are large industrial nations that are more authoritarian and their leadership understands and agrees that pollution is bad and climate change is bad and energy independence is good and renewables are healthy for both the economy and the people and the planet, so all three, they can make unilateral decisions that
Mm-hmm.
change the trend line overnight. And democratic countries have a harder time doing that because like the people have to agree and they have to elect the right people to to make sure that whatever policies they want are going
Yeah.
to be put forth. And then now we have this weird thing where we are ostensibly a democratic country with an authoritarian leader
Mm-hmm.
who doesn't agree with any of those things. Like, it's one thing if a country is saying we're going to make certain decisions because it helps our bottom line and we're going to ignore what we know is the impact on the climate. But then we've got this weird crank sort of group in power now that's like, la la, I don't believe the science, and
Mm-hmm.
almost I want to do these things from an ideological perspective simply because they make me look strong and they
Yeah.
make me look like I'm not the other guys.
Yeah. There's a lot of nihilism, I think, among like ruling elites in the US. I mean, especially though not exclusively at all on the conservative side of the political spectrum. By nihilism, I mean just like they don't have a plan for the future, because
Hmm.
this is not a plan for the future. This is actually, if you think there's no future, this is how you act. You
Yeah,
like
this is a plan
extract
for
as quickly.
accelerating the
Yeah,
end.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. It's
yeah, yeah.
apocalyptic. And I think there's
Hmm.
something, I mean, you keep saying, oh, I'm a psychologist, I'm not but like the psychology is very important to the politics here. We could
Mm.
even like use some Freud to like understand what are they doing, because they're,
Hmm.
what we even can say is like their death drive is like really activated. Like they are just
Right.
like, they're on a, and so they're looking, and the way I think about it is like, the Republican Party, the kind of big tech, the big oil, big finance, all of these like industries that are just like hurrying along our demise right now in a variety of ways, planetary demise, but also like trying to automate people out of their jobs, like destroy communities, these data centers everywhere. I mean, there's just like so much going on that there's obviously no clear plan for an actual like future resilient, vibrant political politics and economics in the US. Like the idea is
Hmm.
like, let's grab what we can now. Let's like inflate the value of our assets, whether the asset is like the shares we own, whether the asset is our fancy house or whatever it is, just like make sure that stays valuable, like put a moat around it, or like, live in a gated community or a bunker. We actually do believe in climate change, right? This is the tricky thing. Like they believe in the apocalyptic stuff. They just don't want to change anything about society to protect the vulnerable or like
Hmm.
create new, future oriented industries. They're like, yeah, the seas might, the sea levels might rise, but like my house will be protected and my grandkids will get their inheritance. And that's about as far out as I think that they're thinking. And it's in sharp contrast to like, not to glorify other leaders in other countries who all have problems that we could critique, but there are places in the world where there is a more future orientation. Like, what do we need to be sustainable and resilient, not just environmentally sustainable, but in all senses, like economically sustainable, the resiliency of supply chains, the resiliency of our economic sectors, of our political system itself. Like, how are we going to ensure that for future generations, like a sense of intergenerational justice and of futurity? And like, I feel like our ruling elite has just given up. Like even the like robber barons who we could critique forever, they were horrible and like exploitative and all that and way too wealthy. And it was the Gilded Age like 100 years ago, but they like donated to libraries. Like they wanted stuff to outlive them and like wanted their legacy to be like important to the future. And it's like the current crop has like given up. I think it makes it scarier to me.
It is. And I think there's this added layer of if it were just about profit, it would kind of make a lot more sense algorithmically.
It's not just that.
There's a psychology of I want to do the dark thing because it means I'm different than the other guy.
Yes. And actually that's such an important point here. And I'm going to leap back to China where I kind of brought up a little bit before, which is that one of the things that Trump and his government, like, and the Department of Energy and other parts of his government that relate to the energy sector, like what they specifically say is renewable energy is like pro-China. Like if you do renewable energy or you do electric vehicles, lithium batteries, whatever it is, you are betting on China. In a way, they have a point, right? Like China, the Chinese firms and the Chinese government has really like propelled those industries, dominates a lot of those sectors. Like I get what they're saying, but they're kind of saying like, we're not going to play in that game. We're not like, that is a game that's like rigged by China in their view. And instead we're going to do what we do best. Like the US is already the world's #1 producer and exporter of oil and gas. So we're going to double down on our comparative advantage, which is that, and we'll just see who wins. We'll see whether the world goes for fossil fuels or renewables. That's how they view it. That's what they say. The issue is, even from a US national security interest, which is not my way of thinking about politics, but like even if we take that, it's a losing proposition because more and more of the world, and this is even in recent weeks, this is becoming apparent. We're really in a moment of like history's moving fast. Like a lot of other countries in the world, from Europe to Africa to Asia to Latin America, are betting on the other proposition. And
of
so
course,
this
especially
looks like
developing nations where they're building their infrastructure right now. Yeah. It's like, why would they build antiquated infrastructure?
No, and expensive, right? Because like a lot of them are oil importers and oil prices are volatile. And like they don't want to be stuck with that. They want, as you said a few moments ago, like energy independence and resilience, which renewables provide much more of.
Well, and also, like, let's be honest, and maybe I'm oversimplifying things here, but like Trump has a cell phone. Like, it's not just about where we're getting our energy. It's also about the tools, the actual technology that we need to be able to have a future independent of whether we're talking about a green or a not green economy. Like we are going to be dependent on countries like China in order to have an iPhone, right?
Totally. And so this whole thing is so incoherent. Like, I'll just go to another, like, take this from a different angle, which is that, so my book, a lot of it is about lithium in particular. I know you know that, but saying it to the listeners, so a lot of it's about lithium in particular, but more broadly, this kind of suite of minerals that the US government and other governments call critical minerals. A lot of those minerals are considered critical because they relate to the energy transition or energy technologies, but also because they might relate to like military or like the tech industry or AI or semiconductors, all sorts of different end uses, right? But anyway, we keep this list of critical minerals. And Trump, it's very fascinating. He's obsessed with critical minerals from his prior government in, the first government, inaugurated in 2017 to his current government. He has been obsessed with and now he calls it mineral dominance. He has a new term that he's used in multiple executive actions. Like the US needs to dominate on these minerals. We need to like have as many mining projects as possible, as many American mining companies like in the game, the whole thing. And he's fast tracking mining projects. That's all happening. At the same time, he is destroying demand and investment downstream from the mining in what these minings go into, what the minerals go into. And it's so if you're trying, we know that to not figure out the like coherence of Trump's brain, but it is a particularly remarkable case where it's like he loves lithium, he hates lithium batteries. I don't, or he hates EVs. He doesn't even hate lithium batteries because there's some lithium batteries. He likes them for like energy storage on the grid for certain. It's just bizarre. Like the bill that the Republicans passed, the OBA, one big beautiful whatever. I hate saying the name of the bill.
Yeah.
They gave some money not only to nuclear but also to geothermal energy and to stationary battery storage, what they think is okay, but they don't like EVs. It's all so bizarre.
It's like he doesn't like EVs because he's like mad at his ex-boyfriend. Like it's the weirdest thing.
That's why the psychology is important. There was one moment where I was like, oh my God, we're going to get this solidified, ungodly, like Musk-Trump alliance. And like, we're going to like Tesla is going to be like pushed as a brand out of the White House. And like that's its own nefarious thing.
It is. Like, I was worried about that, but honestly, by comparison,
I know, right? Like this might even be worse. He's like, and now, I mean, oh my God, there's just so many bizarre things. And so, right. So he likes the mining. He doesn't like what the mining is used for. He of course doesn't want to govern the mining well either. He just wants mineral mining companies to be happy. They're an important part of the Republican coalition, is like one piece, of that. But it's all incoherent. He wants to do great power politics, and he wants to be the great negotiator and the great deal maker. But I just feel like he and others in his cabinet like do not understand the kind of shape of the global economy and where it's heading. Because otherwise, I think they would make, in theory, again, if they cared about the future, if they cared about anything other than their own wealth and their own like egos, like they would lay different foundations for like the future American economy than they're doing right now.
It makes me wonder, and again, I've said this before, not to simplify things, but maybe there's a thread here that I would like to pull. It makes me wonder how fundamental gender, I'm not going to say sex, I'm going to say gender, so really identity around gender, plays in to so much of this geopolitical landscape. I just can't
so
help.
Much.
Yeah. Like, okay, we do not raise our boys. And when I say we, I mean across the globe. There are varying levels of this in different countries, but there is no such thing as a matriarchal, and there have only been a few matrilineal societies, right? So like when we're talking about living in a patriarchy that's global, we do not raise our boys to have empathy. We see it as a weakness in them, and so we try to like raise it out of them. And we see ego as like the most important asset that they can protect. And it makes me so curious how different things would be if because we still know that by and large, there are men behind the scenes making all of these decisions, right? I mean, there are nations that are run by women now. And we see, like Iceland is a great example where a lot of like upper level government is female. Yes, Iceland has a lot of their own natural resources and they're going to be just fine. Their whole country is geothermal, which is amazing. But it does make me wonder how different the landscape would be if like men's egos weren't at the center of it.
Yeah, I think that, it is very relevant. I take this term from another person that works in political science. I guess she's more of a political theory person, but Kara Daggett, she has this great term, petromasculinity, I think it is.
I love it. Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't even have to define it. We just know what it means.
Exactly. And that's very strong in the US. And again, like the fact that the US identifies like a clear economic interest and a geopolitical interest in promoting its own oil and gas sector globally and ensuring that there's continued demand for oil and gas. And then the fact that like there's a whole cultural politics around that, which are getting very exacerbated right now with like energy itself being like a culture war arena. I mean, this wasn't even the case 10 years ago. Actually, like back in the day, like, I don't know, in the 90s, early 2000s, like Republicans in Texas, like lawmakers in Texas, like were really into Texas being this like boom town for like renewable energy. Like Texas has a lot of wind. And so, and it wasn't a culture war issue. It wasn't like abortion or like gender roles or race or like these other issues that become like, really polarized between Republicans and Democrats. And yet now over the past few years, we've seen like types of energy sources be like coded as liberal or conservative, and then also the gender coding and other cultural coding around them. So it's really hard to understand like why it is that like geothermal good, solar bad. Like if you don't understand the way that like Republicans talk about quote unquote clean, firm power sources as good, so that's
Mm-hmm.
nuclear, geothermal, battery storage, those are called clean, firm, which is like an energy wonk jargon term that Republicans didn't invent, but they've really glommed onto. And I think the clean, firm, I won't overdo it, but there's something phallic there. There's something going on there where they're
Yes.
like, these are reliable, unlike that flitty solar and wind that's not always shining or blowing. And it's just like, there's no other way to make sense of it. These are all just energy sources. We could use all of them. We could be an energy powerhouse in every energy sector and like dominate the world. Like we could do all this stuff, but instead they're like, this type of energy is like masculine and resilient and reliable and strong and clean. And this other type of energy is like Chinese and female and like, questionable for all these
Yeah, and
reasons.
like kind of trans, So
Yeah,
it's like we got to stay away from that. I mean,
yeah,
it's
exactly.
insane.
It is
It reminds
crazy.
me of a study that I remember talking to Chris Mooney from I don't even think he was at Washington Post back then. It was so long ago when he was writing some of his early books about like the Republican war on science or the Republican brain. And he cited this fascinating study where people who self-identified as either hard right or hard left were shown light bulbs. This was when they were phasing out like incandescent light
Oh,
bulbs.
yes.
And literally they gave the specs on the bulbs and they were like, this LED bulb is cheaper, it lasts longer, it has less pollution, it's better for the environment. And they were like, I choose the incandescent bulb. And it was like literally just a show of their petro masculinity because there was
Yeah.
no reason to
Other
like it
reason.
more.
Yeah. But we have to understand this stuff as like climate advocates and organizers because the cultural stuff matters, like including in the
Mm-hmm.
communities that we're trying to organize in, like in the political sphere when we're trying to like get, a modicum of consensus for like legislation that can support renewable energy or the energy transition or just transition. Like it matters how people what their preconceptions are or assumptions are about different energy sources. It doesn't mean that like you can't break through. Sometimes it means that you just, use different language, right? Like to describe the same thing to make it appealing to people that may be skeptical, right? But we really can't do climate organizing without being aware of all this language and framing.
I agree. And it makes me wonder. I actually just got into not an argument, but like a debate with my other co-hosts last week about the Bill Gates memo.
Mm.
And, their take was it's completely tone deaf. So many people are angry. Like, what is he doing? He's lost the plot. And I was like, I don't know. I think it was intentional. I think he's
Say
doing
more.
exactly what you just mentioned. Like
Oh,
he's
that's interesting.
speaking to a people who won't listen otherwise. And he's like,
Mm-hmm.
but, and they're saying, no, he just gave them fodder to say, see, we were right all along. And I'm like, that's what they need sometimes. They
Yeah, it's
need to
so
have that
hard.
ego
I
boost.
know. It's so hard to where to draw the line on that because I understand what you're
Mm-hmm.
saying. Like there's been a general trend of there's this term that some one of these think tanks created, climate realism, which is
Mm-hmm.
like, let's be realistic. Like, we're not going to bend the curve down to 2C. Like, we're going to live in a 4C world. Let's just accept that. And let's like do what we can to like protect ourselves and protect the national security interest. So it's like this weird thing where like, it's not exactly the Bill Gates thing, but
Mm-hmm.
it's a little adjacent where you're kind of like being quote unquote realistic, but also to maybe like undermine like full enthusiasm and confidence for like a more full-throated energy
Yeah.
transition and like where you draw that line. I mean, I think it's important to be realistic about how bad things have gotten on the emissions front and how the fact that even though, as we were saying, like a lot of global south countries, China itself, are making these massive pivots to renewable energy, it's not that it's too late, because I don't think in those terms, but it's more that like that has to happen so much faster. And like the US also needs to be on board for that to really like bend the emissions curve in a way that's going to like make less likely the worst case scenarios of climate change and global warming. And so it's not like I'm against being honest about that fact, but I am against that like decreasing our avid enthusiasm for like full steam ahead with an energy transition. Like I don't want to acclimate to the status quo, but I think it's important to be realistic about how bad things have gotten on the emission scenarios.
I agree with you. And I can't help but see a parallel. And again, my mind works in mysterious ways. But I think back to the letter, I think it was that MLK wrote, the letter from a Birmingham jail where he talks
Mm.
about how it's not the clanner or the like white citizens counselor. I mean, yes, those people are scary, and yes, those people are
Oh, the
directing
white
policy,
moderate.
but it's the
Yeah.
white moderate. It's like,
Yeah, totally. I totally agree. Yeah.
yeah, and especially when the window has shifted, right? And the right has gone so far to the right that what
Yeah,
seems like moderate policy in the US is pretty center right now. And anything
totally.
that's center left that is deemed extreme.
Yeah, exactly. And just to go into how these forces can like play out in politics, like the tech industry, like just a
Mhm.
decade ago was really considered, less than a decade ago, I don't even know why, you don't have to go that far back, but just a few election cycles ago was
Yeah.
kind of considered like a kind of democratic aligned industry. Like that's where a lot of their donations went. There were a lot of connections between like Silicon Valley and like the democratic establishment in California, for example. And I
And they were
didn't
like young and like
yeah.
pro-gay and like
Yeah,
pro-abortion and
exactly.
yeah.
And like socially progressive. And then like, okay,
Mhm.
wait, they didn't treat their workers well and people started going on
Right.
strike. And then there was Me Too stuff. And then like they kind of backlashed against their own like too woke employees. Like, and all these weird
Mhm.
things, speaking of psychology, happened
Yeah.
that like made the tech industry move right. I mean, it did it in its own way because I think that they've realized that there was more affinity with some of what their economic project was and the kind of right wing and even fascism and like techno fascism, but
Yeah,
also
yeah.
they were partly reacting against the like progressiveness of their own milieu that was like also making their workers a little like uppity, like, oh, we want like better DEI stuff at work and like we want labor unions at work. And they're like, no, 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 that's not what we like agree with like abortion rights, but we don't agree with like economic equality or racial equality or anything else.
Right, yeah. They're
So
like,
they had a
you
limit.
are our servants and we are in
Exactly.
charge. Like, know your
Exactly.
place.
And
Yeah.
so they shifted right. But like the reason I bring this up is like, there was a way that this was like a politically swing sector. Like it was
Mhm.
liberal, now it's conservative, but like now it's like part of like really, again, I'm using the word fascism. I don't know what all your listeners think, but like we are in a very scary authoritarian moment.
Yes. Yes.
There are some cool things happening in social movements, some cool progressive election outcomes. It's not all bad. The US is a big place, like a lot of political diversity, but on the federal front, it's like pretty fucking terrible, right?
Mhm.
And like the
Yeah.
tech industry, who we might have thought as like moderate, reasonable, they're literally supposed to be rational, enlightened. They're like technologists, like they care about science in theory. All of them made these huge net zero commitments that they've all dropped. I mean, and so you want to go to the letter in the Birmingham jail and think about how the white moderate can really
Mhm.
side on the wrong side of history.
Yep.
We could really apply that today.
I think so too. I'm super curious because I literally could keep doing this for another hour, but that is rude of me because I don't, because those who join me on the show know that we're only going to talk for an hour. But I'm really curious, kind of coming back to how you approached this, not just how you approach your work, right? Because this is your life's work, but how you approached this book, which is not an academic book, it's a trade publication.
Mm.
Uh, how does one sit down and talk about a very complicated problem without, or I shouldn't say without, but with the expectation, I'm assuming from like an editor and a publisher, that there be a narrative of hope and that there be some sort of news you can use or how do we get ourselves unfucked message here?
Yeah. So, I mean, one answer is like I rewrote it probably like 3 times.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's if you ask any author, especially this type of book, like, how did it come out this way? They will be like, there's so many pages on the cutting room floor, and like
Yeah.
so much I had to rethink and restructure and like think about my whole research topic and area of interest from the perspective of like a somewhat more ordinary reader, like someone,
Mhm.
maybe college education, maybe in college now, or maybe working in whatever field but not an energy expert, but like a little interested enough to like pick up the book. Like what does it feel like for them to like walk through these topics? Like what tools do they need? What arguments and concepts do they need? But how do you introduce those without like hitting them over the head with it? Because once you start saying like, I'm going to define this term, or like I argue X, Y, and Z, like people just go to sleep or they put it
Yeah.
down. Like
Yeah.
it sounds academic, it sounds pedantic. So you can't use like the crutches of academic writing, which are very like these like sentences that tell the reader exactly what you're doing.
Mhm.
Instead, you have to like weave it in through like storytelling or through like sneaking in like a conceptual definition or like using a parentheses in like an artful way so that the reader like can put one foot in front of the other and like turn the page and understand everything in a cumulative way. And so that was really, I had to learn that. I had to backwards engineer it. I had to learn from other friends who are great writers, from great editors that I worked with. So that's that whole piece. But the other thing you're asking me is just as, if not more important, which is like, how do I approach this without bumming people out?
Yeah, or yourself. Like, how do you
Or
approach your
myself.
whole life and your whole
Oh God.
career?
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know?
Well, I'm like blessed or cursed with like a slightly I've already said find the silver lining probably twice in this podcast because that's me, which can be annoying to some people who are more cynical.
Yeah, but
And
we
I can
need
be,
people like you.
yeah, and I can be
Yeah.
cynical. Like I'm ruthless about the powerful and the systems that are bad. Like it's not like I'm like trying to treat everything with kid gloves, but
Mhm.
I want to care about people's affects, about their emotions, about their ability to kind of like stay in the struggle and like stay in the advocacy and stay with the critical thinking without getting really scared or really
Mhm.
nihilistic. Like I understand that what I work on, both the climate stuff writ large, but also specifically looking at the kind of worst parts of the energy transition can actually make people polarize against the energy transition. And in fact, going back to our discussion of Republicans, they have in really bad faith ways sometimes use some of the stuff I talk about, like the environmental impacts of the energy transition related mining, or the fact that batteries can be hazardous or like go on fire or whatever, or the fact that sometimes solar farms have environmental impacts, right? Like they have latched onto that stuff to polarize against the energy transition and to support oil and gas instead, which is
Yeah.
ludicrous because oil and gas is also terrible for biodiversity and all the other things that, we hold dear. But okay, I don't want to treat this in a bad faith way. I want to assume that like I can trust the reader and treat the reader as an adult and as like an
Mhm.
ethical subject. Like and being ethical doesn't mean you have the right answer. It's different than like a stark moral proposition. I'm not saying right and wrong. Ethics is about situational judgment, right? It's about
Yeah.
how we land in certain situations. There are trade-offs, there are tensions. We make a choice that means we're not making a different choice. We have real contingency in our lives and real moments where we are at a fork in the road and we have to grapple with like different possibilities. And I want to like treat the reader as someone that, like me, thoughtfully thinks about something from multiple angles and comes
Mhm.
out not totally disillusioned, but just having a more nuanced perspective and maybe more commitment to doing things the best way possible, but
And which you
knowing that like the best way isn't a way with no harm, no
yeah.
problems, no conflict. Like that's a utopia, which is nice to read about in a novel. And I love utopian fiction, and it's like cool, like, and utopian political philosophy. I'm not, no shade on utopia as like a concept, but we live in the world we live in, and we want to bring it closer to utopia. But like in the pathway there are going to be struggles, there are going to be conflicts. We're going to disagree with one another, even among progressives and leftists, about like how to
Mhm.
proceed. And I want to equip people for that complexity rather than like dumb down and be like, oh, it's all easy, or like leave it to the experts. That's not treating people like adults or like ethical subjects, in my view.
Absolutely, and the truth of the matter is you can't grapple with the, ethical complexity if you don't understand the problem, and I think that that's
Exactly.
something that you do so beautifully is communicate the landscape with a lot of really rich examples that illustrate the landscape, so that
Yeah.
it's not theoretical. It takes it back to reality, which I think maybe it's a protective mechanism, but a lot of us are really good at making geopolitics not just far away, but like an intellectual exercise when it's not. It's real life.
Exactly. And this is like really coming home in lots of ways because, like, as I talk about in the book, and some listeners might be aware, there's a lot of these mining projects being constructed or at least proposed in the US. So this is not a problem of like, oh, those far away exotic places and like,
Mhm.
oh, the sacrifice zones far away. This is like, this is a US issue. This is a Europe issue. It's a China issue. It's a Latin America, everywhere in the world in varying ways is like grappling with building these supply chains, and then communities and workers and other constituencies on the ground are like, how does this affect us? Is this the road to a better future? Is this more of the same, colonial oppression like we were talking about before, or the same labor
Yeah.
exploitation? Is this more of the same, like the tech industry keeps growing more powerful, or is this actually like a public and democratic innovation project where we're actually trying to innovate our ways collectively into a better world, right? Like these are really different political projects that could all be about these supply chains, but have fundamentally different values, different constituencies, different ideologies attached to them. And to me, it's fascinating, which is part of what makes it less depressing because the conflicts are real, but like the conflicts aren't just like good and evil or like, you know, the strong and the weak. The conflicts are also like competing worldviews of like how we make a green economy. And like they're really different from one another. And I think we should take that seriously and like try to construct the best version of a green economy possible, which means thinking about the resource use and the mining stuff from the get-go, because that's some of the worst, where we see the worst impacts, unfortunately.
Absolutely. I mean, this is what real problem solving looks
Exactly.
like. Yeah. I can't thank you enough. I'm curious, Thea, is there anything before we say goodbye today? I mean, there's a million things we didn't get to, but is there anything that is sticking out to you about the book, about the work that, like big glaring things that we left out of our conversation?
You know, there's so much I could say here because we've talked about a lot, but also there's a lot we didn't talk about, which I hope like whets the appetite to read the book among the listeners. But I loved it. I mean, this was such a great conversation that went in a lot of directions. I guess one thread that I want to pick up on to maybe leave listeners. This is like a sciencey podcast, and a lot of people that are interested in climate and energy and the environment are like listening to this. And we talked about how the Inflation Reduction Act is kind of being dismantled right now. It lived a short life. And that's upsetting. Even though I had my critiques of it, it's upsetting to see like this sort of milestone, you know, again, be destroyed and us revert to an even more fossil intensive economy. Yeah. That said, we have a blank slate. I mean, meaning whatever is next for like having progressives in office again, for like revisiting this topic of climate action and environmental protection and energy transition, whether at the federal level, whether at the state or local level, like now it's sort of like we have to reopen the whole set of ideas of like, how should we do this? Like the IRA, apparently the Inflation Reduction Act was not politically sustainable. And that's not just because of Trump. It's also because it didn't create the type of coalition it needed to. And it didn't address some of the issues that like working class communities face as they try to also be part of this energy transition. So that I believe that like there was flaws from the beginning and Trump, you know, took a sledgehammer to it. But it is a moment where I think progressives, climate advocates, energy advocates need to think like, how will we do it differently next time? The next time could be right now. It could be in Zoran's New York City or Kate Wilson's Seattle. She just was declared the winner. You know, and she's a big advocate of, you know, energy transit and among a variety of progressive causes, right? Or it could be in Gavin Newsom's California. We don't even have to go to the far left of the Democratic Party, which is more where I'm at. But like, you know, we could go to the more moderates, but like, okay, they still are committed to an energy transition. Gavin Newsom right now is like railing against Trump wanting to do more offshore drilling. So there are still places at the state and local level that are committed to like some kind of energy politics and energy transition. Federally, you know, Democrats could be back in power. There might be a blue wave with the midterm. Maybe the next presidency is Democratic. All I'm saying is, assuming we still have elections, which is, you know, a little bit questionable. I don't want to get too attached to that idea, but we've had some elections recently and Trump did not have a good night in any of them, right?
True.
And so we got to think now, like, when we are back in power, if we are back in power, if we claw our way back in, and the we is not me, like identifying with the Democratic establishment, but just like progressive forces that are committed to an energy transition are back in power. What are we going to do?
Yeah.
We're not going to just
rational actors, right?
Exactly.
When rational actors are back in power, they will be walking into a vacuum because of the sheer destruction and chaos that has been sown. So you're right. And, like, talk about silver linings.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, we didn't want this, but hey, now we can at least start from a bit of a clean slate.
Exactly. And I think that is like, I don't want to like diminish the pain and all the emissions and environmental harm that is coming out of like the scrapping of all the environmental rules. But some of them could have stood to be written differently. The laws could have been better. I think the constituencies and stakeholders involved in terms of communities and workers and more like ordinary consumers could have had more input in that versus like the lobbying that went on to kind of shape some of what the IRA was. And we should not get distracted. I mean, of course, we have to think about the human cost. I mean, right now people are suffering the lack of SNAP benefits. There's a lot to be concerned about. So I'm not saying it's a distraction to think about that. But what I mean is don't get distracted by like all the spectacles out of the White House. We need to stay grounded in like, what's our mission, what are our
Yeah.
goals, what are the ethical difficulties that we also have to grapple with within our coalition, and like what will we do when we can govern again. And that's like being serious. That is us trying to be like adults in the room and like not just be like sad about being like political losers for the time being, but like wanting to actually like be back in power, and wanting, if we're not in power, let's say we're community organizations or social movements or labor unions on the outside, like how are we going to shape the political terrain to get better climate outcomes and better economic outcomes?
Mm. Hear, hear. Everybody. The book is Extraction, The Frontiers of Green Capitalism by Dr. Thea Riofrancos. Thank you so much for being here, Thea.
This was truly a delight. I like loved your questions. It just so much food for thought. So thank you for having me.
Oh, it was a joy. I learned an awful lot. I hope that the listeners did too. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.